Thank you, Cathaoirleach, and Gora Mila Mahagat, Minister. I and my party truly welcome this domestic violence bill and thank you most sincerely for all the work that you have done on it and for bringing this bill to the Oireachtas. At the outset, I just want to maybe just take a couple of things off the debate, if you like. Domestic violence can happen to anybody. It does happen to men. And it does happen to women. It can happen in the LGBT community, and my own colleague here is going to talk about that in a couple of minutes. It can happen to anybody of any social strata as well, right across the board. In my contribution, I'm going to refer to victims, just for the want of a better word, but I like to think of all victims of all people who experience domestic violence as survivors, whether they are in the situation at the moment and surviving in that situation, or whether they are survivors that have come out the other side of it. So I just wanted to take those things off the table. I now hope that this bill can be improved even further as it goes through the houses of the Oireachtas, and I and my Sinn Féin colleagues will not be found wanting in helping to make this bill as good as it can be at this time. I want to thank Safe Ireland and to welcome Sharon here today, who I've worked with in a past life, and others, Women's Aid, and all those working in women's refuges and rape crisis centres throughout the 32 counties, because I have met women from Shankill Road as well as women from Cork who both work in the area and have experienced domestic violence themselves. I want to thank St Vincent de Paul and Amnesty International as well, and others who I've forgotten who I've worked with over the years. I want to thank them for their work in campaigning tirelessly for changes to legislation, and indeed for the wonderful work that they do every day for survivors of domestic violence. In that context too, I want to acknowledge the work of John Hennessy from Cork, who has done exceptional work across all of these areas, and who for me wholly and completely captures the evil dynamic that exists when perpetrators of domestic violence set to work on their victims. Indeed, his books are titled Mind of the Abuser and Freeing Her Mind, I think help make sense of the question that many people ask. Well, why doesn't she just leave? And we know that it takes on average 7 years for a woman to leave a domestic violence situation. And for the woman, it helps also to make sense for the women currently experiencing abuse and violence. I think he helps them to recognise the power and control games that are being played to destroy their self-esteem. Above all, today, I want to acknowledge the courage, strength and resilience of the women and children who have experienced domestic violence, and those who continue to live with abuse, and those who have managed to leave. Today, I want us to remember the 209 plus women who have died violently in Ireland since 1996. And I want to remember all those too who have died prematurely because of the violence and abuse that has been inflicted upon them. I want to acknowledge their suffering and that of their families. I also want to acknowledge all of the adults who have been robbed of their childhood, who have survived domestic violence as well. So let's be clear, domestic violence is one of the most heinous crimes that can be committed. It is a crime that most often is repeated day after day and night after night for years and sometimes decades. We often express shock and outrage about one-off incidents that inflict violence on a victim, and rightly so. So why then do we turn a blind eye to domestic violence? Why then do we have an inherent tolerance to sustained attacks on human beings just because the violence often occurs behind closed doors, or because the violence is inflicted by a perpetrator who is known to the victim? What does that say about us as a society? What does it say about us as legislators? It was referred to earlier on that this was a timely bill. In my opinion, it's 100 years too late. I want to refer to the barriers that prevent many leaving much sooner than they could if these barriers were removed and appropriate supports were put in place. I speak about these barriers from an experience of working with women and children experienced in domestic violence over a number of years. The lack of alternative accommodation is one of the biggest barriers. This ranges from the shortage of refuge beds to the lack of transitional housing to the spiralling rents and the lack of more permanent social housing. Women and children fleeing domestic violence must be exempt from the red tape and the bureaucracy surrounding housing applications. Yes, the woman may be the joint owner of the house, but if she is fleeing for her life, she can hardly call it home. To this end, I say that all housing officers should have domestic violence training so that they truly understand the dangers and dynamics of the situation of the woman sitting before them. We need to remove the property tax for cohabitants, as you referred to earlier on, for applying for a barring order, where the best interests of the children of the family so requires. If there is a strong pragmatic reason that this cannot be done, we need the duration of the short-term barring order to be at least 6 months for the cohabitant applicants that do not satisfy the property test. Indeed, the maximum duration of a barring order should be extended to 5 years. Garda must be allowed to apply for out-of-order barring orders to an on-call judge. The return date would be the next sitting date in the nearest available court. This would enable victims of domestic violence to be protected out of hours and will strengthen the power of the Gardaí, who are often trying to deal with domestic violence without having the legislation they need to do the job they want to do to ensure the safety of victims, and I hope that this legislation can do that. Gardaí must be empowered to deliver safety and barring orders as a matter of course. The practice of a person suffering abuse having to deliver an order to the perpetrator is absurd. We know that the most dangerous time for a woman is when she is trying to leave. The practice of the perpetrator, who may be barred from the house, having unsupervised access to children, is absolutely terrifying. It is imperative that the risk posed by the perpetrator of domestic violence to the children of the family and the impact of such abuse on them is assessed, and that the immediate interim measures are taken to protect the children. I welcome the fact, Minister, that this bill recognises violence and abuse inflicted by perpetrators who are living separate to the victim of domestic violence, and indeed all that can be done to abuse a victim through social media and all of that. It is past time that was done. But Minister, these are just a few elements we need to do to shore up this bill. At committee stage, Sinn Féin and I will have a number of amendments to enhance this bill. You have our absolute assurance that we will continue to do everything possible to expedite this legislation. Finally, but most importantly, this legislation must be underpinned by additional resources for frontline services. I want you to take the legislation, when the budget is being discussed, put it on the table of the Minister for Finance and say, I have done all this really good work, now we need the resources to be able to make it meaningful. So this involves additional funding for refuges, helplines and cross-agency and community training. And that includes mandatory training for judges, which I will speak about at another stage. But according to Save Ireland, 5,000 requests for refuges were refused last year. Minister, this is criminal in itself. Thank you very much for all the work that you've done, and we look forward to working with you over the coming weeks.
Thank you very much, Senator.